The Cowboys' Temporary Family by Joan Savage. Chapter 1. The Offer. The eviction notice was pink. Grace Miller thought that was almost funny. The cruelest piece of paper she had ever received, and someone had chosen to print it in the color of bubblegum and birthday parties. She stood in the doorway of her small apartment, the notice trembling in her fingers, and listened to the sound of her son singing to himself in the kitchen while he poured cereal into a bowl he could barely reach. 30 days. She had 30 days to find $1,200 she did not have, or she and Ethan would be sleeping in her car. "Mama, the milk's being stubborn again," Ethan called out. Grace folded the notice, tucked it into the back pocket of her jeans, and arranged her face into something that looked like a normal Tuesday morning. She walked into the kitchen, took the milk carton from her 7-year-old's determined hands, and poured it over his cereal with practiced calm. Her 7-year-old's determined, "There you go, baby. I almost had it." He looked up at her with her own green eyes, staring back at her from a rounder, more trusting face. Ethan Miller was all cowlicks and scraped knees, and absolute certainty that the world was a good place. Grace intended to keep it that way for as long as she possibly could. She kissed the top of his head and turned to the window so he wouldn't see her face. Outside, Cutter's Creek was waking up slow, the way small Texas towns always did. The feed store across the street was rolling up its metal door. Old Pete Larson was walking his ancient beagle past the diner. The live oaks along the main road were turning gold at the edges, October arriving like a quiet apology after the long, brutal summer. Grace had lived in Cutter's Creek her entire life, except for the 3 years she'd spent in San Antonio being married to Derek Miller, who had turned out to be a liar, a cheat, and a man who thought child support was optional. To be a liar? She'd come back home with a toddler on her hip and nothing in her savings account, and she had rebuilt herself piece by piece, the way you do when there's a child watching you, and you cannot afford to fall apart. She worked at Cutter's Creek Veterinary Clinic, 40 hours a week, sometimes more when Dr. Haynes needed her to cover emergencies. She loved the work. She did not love the paycheck, which stretched like old elastic and snapped at the worst possible moments. Like now. She was thinking about the notice, running numbers in her head, calculating impossibilities, when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but it had a local area code, so she answered. "Is this Grace Miller?" The voice was low and rough, like gravel shifting under boot heels. "It is. Who's calling?" A pause. "Wyatt Brooks." Grace blinked. She knew the name, the way everyone in Cutter's Creek knew it. Grace blinked. Brooks Ranch was the oldest and largest spread in the county. 1,200 acres of prime hill country land that had belonged to the same family since before Texas was a state. She had treated a few of their horses at the clinic over the years. She had never spoken to Wyatt Brooks directly. He was the kind of man who kept to himself so thoroughly that his solitude had become a kind of legend. "Mr. Brooks?" she said carefully. "What can I do for you?" Another pause, longer this time, as if the words were being dragged up from somewhere deep and reluctant. "I need to speak with you. In person, if you're willing. It's about a business proposition." Grace looked at the back pocket of her jeans, where the pink notice sat like a stone. "I'm listening," she said. She met him at the ranch that afternoon, after dropping Ethan at school and trading her shift at the clinic for a later start. She had expected the ranch to be impressive. She had not expected it to stop her breath. The ranch to be impressive. Brooks Ranch sat in a wide valley between 2 limestone ridges, the kind of landscape that made you feel like the land itself was watching you. The main house was a 2-story structure of weathered timber and stone, with a deep porch that ran the entire width of the front and rocking chairs that looked like they had held generations of tired bones. Beyond the house, The barn rose red against the pale sky, and the pastures stretched so far that the cattle grazing in them looked like dark punctuation marks on a green page. Wyatt Brooks was waiting on the porch steps. He was taller than she'd expected, broader through the shoulders. He wore worn jeans and a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows despite the October chill, and a dark hat that shadowed his face just enough to make him unreadable. He was not what she would have called handsome, exactly. His features were too angular for that, his jaw too set, his eyes too guarded. But there was a quality to him that commanded attention, the way a mountain commands attention, simply by existing in the landscape. He nodded when she got out of her truck. Not a smile, just a nod. "Ms. Miller, thank you for coming. I'll admit you've got me curious, Mr. Brooks." He held the door open and led her inside to a kitchen that smelled of coffee and old wood, and something she could only describe as permanence. The scent of a place that had been loved for a very long time. He poured 2 cups of coffee without asking whether she wanted one, set them on the table, and sat down across from her. He wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at it for a moment before he spoke. "My father died 6 weeks ago," he said. "I'm sorry," Grace said, and meant it. He was a difficult man. Wyatt's voice carried no particular emotion, though she sensed vast, complicated territory beneath the surface. "He ran this ranch for 40 years, built it into what it is, and he left it to me. He paused. "With conditions." Grace waited. Wyatt looked up then, and his eyes met hers directly for the first time. They were a dark, serious gray, the color of storm clouds over open country. "The will stipulates that in order to inherit full ownership of the ranch, I have to be married and living as part of a family unit by December 31st of this year. If I'm not, the property goes to a distant cousin who will sell it to a developer inside of 6 months." Grace set down her coffee cup. "That's an unusual condition." "My father was an unusual man." Something shifted in his expression. Old grief, old anger, carefully contained. "He believed a man without a family had nothing worth protecting. He spent the last few years of his life making his opinion on the subject very clear." "And you have no one?" she asked, before she could stop herself. The question hung in the air between them. She saw something flicker across his face, something raw and briefly exposed, before it was gone. "No," he said simply. "I don't." "Mr. Brooks." "I know what this sounds like," he said, cutting her off, but not unkindly. "I've been over every other option. I've talked to the lawyers. There's no legal challenge with strong odds, and there isn't enough time. What I need is a wife, on paper, for 1 year. After the year is up, we can divorce quietly, and I'll have met the terms of the will." He reached into the inside pocket of his shirt and placed a folded document on the table between them. "I had a contract drawn up. Everything is detailed. You would receive a monthly living allowance, full use of the ranch house and grounds, medical coverage for you and your son, and a lump sum payment at the end of the year." Grace stared at the document. She did not touch it. "Why me?" she asked. He seemed to have expected the question. "Dr. Haynes speaks highly of you." "You're known in town as someone honest and hardworking. You have a child, which satisfies the family condition of the will. And you are—" He paused, choosing his words. "Currently in a difficult financial situation." She felt the color rise in her cheeks. "You checked up on me." "I needed to make sure this would work for both parties." His voice was matter-of-fact, not apologetic, but not cruel either. "I'm not trying to take advantage of your circumstances, Miss Miller. I'm trying to offer you a way out of them." Grace looked down at her hands. She thought about the pink notice. She thought about Ethan singing over his cereal. She thought about the night last week when she'd stood in the parking lot of the grocery store and tried to decide between the store-brand mac and cheese and the actual cheese. She thought about what it would mean for her son to live on 1,200 acres of Texas countryside for a year, with horses and wide-open sky and room to grow. Countryside for a year. She picked up the document. "I need to read this," she said. "And I need to bring my son. If he hates it here, the answer is no." For the first time, something changed in Wyatt Brooks's face. Not quite a smile, but a small, careful loosening. "Bring him this weekend," he said. "I'll have horses ready." Grace Miller drove back to town with the contract on the passenger seat, and the first fragile, terrifying thread of hope pulling tight in her chest. Chapter 2. The Contract Wedding. Ethan thought the ranch was the greatest place in the world, approximately 45 seconds after he got out of the truck. "Mama!" He grabbed her hand and yanked it with both of his, the way he did when language wasn't enough to contain what he was feeling. "Mama, look at it." "I see it, baby. It's enormous." He said it like a declaration of faith. "Can I touch a horse?" "We just arrived." "But can I?" Wyatt was walking toward them from the barn, and Grace watched her son notice him the way animals notice things. Sudden stillness. Absolute attention. Wyatt stopped a few feet away and looked down at Ethan. Ethan looked up at Wyatt. Two completely different kinds of solitude, sizing each other up. "Are you a real cowboy?" Ethan asked. "I am," Wyatt said. "Do you have a rope?" "Several." Ethan turned to Grace with an expression of total vindication. "Mama, he has ropes." Wyatt Brooks did not smile exactly, but something happened around his eyes. Just the faintest softening, like the first degree of warmth in a frozen morning. "You want to see the horses?" he asked. Ethan looked like he might actually levitate. Grace read the contract 3 times over the following week. She had her friend Deanna, who had taken 1 semester of paralegal studies, read it too. She called a legal aid number and spoke to a real lawyer for 30 minutes. The document was, from every angle she examined it, fair. More than fair. The monthly allowance was nearly double her current salary. The lump sum at the end of the year was enough to put a down payment on a small house of her own. It was also the strangest thing she had ever considered doing in her life. "You're going to marry a man you barely know," Deanna said, sitting across from Grace at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and the expression of someone watching a friend walk toward a bonfire. "On paper," Grace said. "For 1 year. You're going to live in his house. On his ranch. With my son." "Grace." Deanna leaned forward. "What if you fall for him?" Grace laughed, and it came out more brittle than she intended. "Deanna, he's a grumpy, solitary rancher who barely speaks in complete sentences and looks at me like I'm a weather system he needs to plan around. I don't think falling is a concern." "The grumpy ones are always the most dangerous," is a concern. "The practical ones always make the most sensible decisions," Grace replied. "I need a safe place for my son and financial stability. He needs a wife on paper for 12 months. That's all this is." She signed the contract on a Wednesday. The wedding was small, which was perhaps an understatement. It was Grace, Wyatt, a justice of the peace named Gerald, who had a hearing aid and a tendency to repeat himself, and Ethan, who wore his one good button-down shirt and his cowboy boots, and carried the rings in his front pocket because Wyatt had solemnly asked him to serve as ring-bearer, an honor Ethan would reference approximately once a week for the next several months. Deanna came as Grace's witness. Wyatt's ranch foreman, a weathered man named Cole, came as his. They stood in the small room at the county courthouse, under fluorescent lights that hummed with institutional indifference, and said words that Grace had chosen carefully for their legal sufficiency and their absolute neutrality. She had not expected to feel anything during this ceremony. It was a transaction, a piece of paper. She was clear about that. She was not prepared for the moment when Wyatt slid the ring onto her finger. A simple gold band, nothing extravagant, and met her eyes with that serious, guarded gaze, and she felt the solid weight of it settle against her hand, and something inside her lungs contracted. It wasn't love. She was clear about that too. It was the weight of a thing that looked exactly like the real version. "You may kiss the bride," Gerald said, and then, because of the hearing aid situation, said it again. Wyatt looked at her. A question in those gray eyes that hadn't been in the contract. Looked at her. Grace rose up on her toes and pressed her lips briefly to the corner of his jaw. Not quite his lips, not quite just his cheek. A compromise that satisfied the letter, if not the spirit of the instruction. When she stepped back, she thought she saw color rise along the edge of his throat. But he turned away before she could be sure. Ethan, who had been watching all of this with the focused intensity of a small scientist conducting field observations, tugged on Wyatt's sleeve. "Does this mean you're my dad now?" he asked. The room went very quiet. Wyatt looked down at the boy. Something passed through his face that Grace would spend a long time thinking about later. A whole complicated weather system of emotion, moving too fast to name. "It means I'm your mama's husband," he said carefully. "For now." Ethan considered this with solemn 7-year-old gravity. "Okay," he said, "but can I still call you Wyatt?" "Yes," Wyatt said. "You can call me Wyatt." Yeah, Ethan nodded, apparently satisfied, and reached up and took Wyatt's hand to lead him toward the door. Grace watched the large, calloused hand close around her son's small one, and she had to look away quickly and blink at the fluorescent ceiling for a moment before she trusted her face again. Deanna appeared at her elbow. "The grumpy ones," she said softly. "I'm telling you, Grace." Chapter 3. Moving to the ranch. They moved in on a Saturday. Grace had not accumulated much. 4 years of deliberate, careful living had taught her not to cling to things she might need to leave behind. 2 carloads. Her clothes, Ethan's collection of plastic horses, and one very loved stuffed armadillo named Gerald, a coincidence of naming that Ethan found absolutely hilarious. Her kitchen things, her books, her tools from the clinic she kept at home for emergencies. It fit in the bed of her truck and the back of Wyatt's without any trouble. Wyatt had prepared the upstairs for them. 2 rooms at the end of the hall, a bedroom for Grace with a quilt that looked handmade and old, and a smaller room for Ethan with a window that faced the barn. When Ethan saw his window, he stood at it for a full 3 minutes without speaking, which was a personal record. "I can see the horses from here," he finally said in a voice of pure reverence. "That's right," Wyatt said from the doorway. "Can I watch them before bed?" "If you're in bed by 9. Ethan turned around with the expression of a man who has just been given everything he ever wanted. "Deal," he said, and stuck out his hand. Wyatt shook it, grave and formal. "Deal." Grace watched this from the hallway and felt something she had no name for move through her like the first breath of weather before a storm. The first week was an exercise in careful distance. Wyatt rose before dawn, the way ranchers do, and by the time Grace came downstairs, the coffee was made and he was already out working. They had meals together, breakfast when Ethan's school schedule permitted, dinner every evening, and these were polite and careful and full of the particular silence that falls between 2 people who are trying hard not to presume. Ethan had no interest in careful distance. Within 3 days, he had attached himself to Cole, the foreman, who had apparently been starved for the company of a small person, and who began teaching Ethan to identify cattle breeds with the seriousness of a tenured professor. He had also named all 14 horses in the barn, assigning them personalities and backstories with the confident authority of a child novelist. He informed Grace over dinner one evening that the gray mare named Lady was very sophisticated, and that the big bay gelding Wyatt rode was probably a little grumpy but nice inside, like someone else I know, delivered with a sideways look at Wyatt that was so unsubtle it was almost architectural. Wyatt looked at his plate, but Grace, watching from the corner of her eye, saw the faint tremor at the corner of his mouth. He was trying not to smile. She found this almost unbearable in its unexpectedness. She discovered, in those early days, that living alongside Wyatt Brooks was not what she had expected. She had anticipated coldness. She had prepared for it, built her own walls in advance. What she found instead was more complicated. He was not cold. He was contained. There was a difference, she came to understand. A man who keeps everything locked away is still full of things. She could feel the weight of what he carried sometimes. In the evenings, when they sat on the porch after Ethan had gone to bed, the two of them with their coffee, and the vast, star-crowded Texas sky above them, not quite talking. He asked about her work, the second week. She told him about a case at the clinic, a family who had brought in their ancient cattle dog, and how she'd sat with them on the floor while Dr. Haynes helped the dog pass gently, and how she'd driven home crying and then felt, somehow, okay. Wyatt listened to all of this without interruption. When she finished, he said, "That kind of work costs something." "It does," she agreed. "But it's worth it." He nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd been working out privately. Later, doing the dishes, she realized he had told her something too, in his own language. It wasn't words that he dealt in. It was attention, language. He paid attention to things the way most people never bothered to. The way a good rancher watches the land, steady and patient and expecting nothing back. She told herself that was not particularly attractive. She was not entirely convinced. Chapter 4. The cowboy and the boy Ethan had been asking about riding lessons since approximately the moment he arrived on the ranch. He had been asking with the particular frequency of a 7-year-old who has identified a goal and sees no reason why that goal should not be achieved immediately and with maximum enthusiasm. Wyatt held out for 2 weeks, which Grace thought was actually impressive. She came out of the barn one October morning, having arrived early to help with one of the mares who'd been favoring a foreleg, and found Wyatt in the round pen with Ethan. He had Ethan sitting atop a small, patient quarter horse named Penny, and he was walking beside them with his hand near the saddle horn, and he was talking, This was notable because Wyatt did not, as a general rule, talk a lot. He was talking to Ethan, though, quietly, steadily, explaining how to sit, how to hold the reins, how to breathe, and let the horse feel calm come from you rather than anxiety. Ethan was listening with every cell in his body. His small face was fierce with concentration. Grace stood at the fence and watched and did not say a word, because she did not trust herself to say anything at all. "You're gripping," Wyatt said. "You don't have to hold on for your life. She's not going anywhere." "What if she spooks?" Ethan asked. "She won't." "But what if?" "Then you hold on," Wyatt said, with such matter-of-fact confidence that Ethan visibly relaxed in the saddle. "But you breathe first. A scared rider makes a scared horse. A calm rider makes a calm horse." Ethan processed this with enormous seriousness. Then, "What if the rider is scared but pretends to be calm?" A pause. "That works too," Wyatt said. A pause. "Sometimes pretending is where real starts." Grace pressed her palm flat against the fence rail and looked at the October sky and breathed. After that, the riding lessons were every Saturday morning, regular as weather. Ethan talked about them all week. He talked about them so much that Cole, who heard everything that happened on the ranch, began to refer to Saturday as Ethan's rodeo day, with an affection that was entirely unconcealed. What Grace noticed, watching from careful distances, was that Wyatt didn't talk down to her son. He didn't simplify or soften or treat him as something fragile. He talked to Ethan the way he talked to everyone, directly, with the assumption that the listener was capable of understanding. And Ethan, who was sharp as a tack and had spent his whole short life being underestimated, blossomed under this like a plant that had finally found its light. One evening, she found them sitting on the porch steps, Ethan with a piece of rope, and Wyatt talking him through a basic knot with the focused, unhurried attention of a man with nowhere else to be. "Like this?" Ethan held up a tangle. "Not quite. Here." Wyatt took the rope, undid the knot with quick fingers, and handed it back. "The rabbit goes around the tree, not through it." "Rabbits don't climb trees." "In knots they do." Ethan considered this philosophical revision with his whole face. "Okay," he finally conceded. "But I think the rabbit is confused." "Most rabbits are," Wyatt said. Ethan laughed, a big, unself-conscious peal of laughter that rang out across the yard and scattered a pair of doves from the live oak at the corner of the porch. Wyatt watched him laugh with an expression Grace had never seen on his face before. Something open and wondering, as if the boy had shown him something he had not known he was missing. She went back inside before either of them saw her. She had promised herself she would not read things into moments. She had been very firm about that. She stood at the kitchen sink and ran cold water over her wrists and told herself this was all fine. The evening everything shifted began with a thunderstorm. It came in fast and low, the way hill country storms do, and by the time Wyatt had gotten the horses into the barn and Grace had gotten the windows closed, it was coming down in sheets. The power flickered and then held. Ethan, who had been in bed, appeared on the stairs in his pajamas with Gerald the armadillo under one arm. "I'm not scared," he announced, in the tone of someone who is quite scared. "Come on, then," Grace said, and he settled onto the couch between her and where Wyatt had come in from the barn, still damp from the rain, and somehow they were all three of them on the old couch in the living room while the storm threw itself against the windows, and Wyatt found an old western on one of the television channels that still worked, and Ethan was asleep within 20 minutes, one arm thrown across Wyatt's knee with the complete, trustful abandon of a child who feels entirely safe. Wyatt looked at the sleeping boy for a long moment. Then he looked at Grace. "He's a good kid," he said. "He is," she agreed softly. "He's the best thing I've ever done." The rain drummed on the roof. The cowboy on the television said something, but Grace wasn't listening to it anymore. She was watching the way Wyatt sat very still, as if afraid to wake Ethan, his large hand resting carefully not quite on her son's shoulder, holding the weight of something he hadn't asked for and hadn't turned away from. "Wyatt," she said, before she thought about it. He looked at her. "Thank you, for the riding lessons, for the way you talked to him." She shook her head slightly. "He doesn't have a lot of men in his life who take him seriously." Something moved across Wyatt's face. "He's easy to take seriously," he said. The storm cracked loudly above them, and Ethan shifted in his sleep but didn't wake, and Grace found herself thinking that this was the most dangerous kind of pretending. The kind that doesn't feel like pretending at all. Chapter 5. A Family in Name. Only November settled over the ranch like a familiar old coat. The days grew shorter and cooler, and life at Brooks Ranch settled into rhythms that Grace had not anticipated feeling so natural. Morning coffee in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke. Evenings with homework at the big table, while Wyatt reviewed paperwork at the other end. Weekend mornings with Penny in the round pen, and Ethan's voice carrying across the yard. She had expected to feel like a guest. She did not feel like a guest. She felt, unsettlingly, like she lived here. She began, carefully and quietly, making small changes. She moved things in the kitchen to more logical positions, and Wyatt said nothing. She planted herb seedlings in pots on the back porch, and when she came out one morning, they had been moved to catch better light, without comment. She hung a drawing Ethan had made of the ranch on the refrigerator, and it stayed there, and she caught Wyatt looking at it once with an expression she was becoming better at reading. That particular stillness that, in him, meant feeling something. He was not easy to know, but she was learning the language. She knew, for instance, that when the line of his shoulders was tight at dinner, something had gone wrong with the cattle or the equipment. She knew that when he poured a second cup of coffee without offering her one, he was deep in his own head, and it wasn't about her. She knew that the one subject that could shorten his sentences to single syllables was his father, and she had learned not to approach it from the front. She did not know, yet, that he had begun learning her language too. One Friday afternoon, she came home from the clinic with a sprained ankle, courtesy of a large and agitated retriever with poor impulse control, and found Wyatt in the barn and said, "It's fine, just a twist," which was true, and then stepped wrong on the way into the house and made an involuntary noise that was not fine at all. He was there before she registered that he'd moved. Just there, his hand at her elbow, steady and immediate. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine." "You're limping. Sit down." He steered her to the kitchen chair with the unargued authority of someone who has spent 20 years deciding what happens next on 1,200 acres of unpredictable land. "Sit." She sat. He brought ice from the freezer wrapped in a dish towel and knelt in front of her and took her foot in both hands with a gentleness that was so entirely at odds with the size and roughness of those hands that she forgot to object. "Where does it hurt?" she told him. He pressed carefully. She made a sound. "It's not broken," he said. "But you need to stay off it tonight. I have to make dinner. I know how to make dinner." She looked at him, kneeling on the kitchen floor, holding her foot, entirely matter-of-fact about all of it. His hat was off. He took it off in the house, always, and she was suddenly aware of how different he looked without it. Younger, more exposed. The dark hair showing the first threads of gray at the temples. "Wyatt." He looked up at the temples. Their eyes were level, with him kneeling and her sitting, and for a disorienting moment, the distance between them seemed to compress to almost nothing. "You don't have to take care of me," she said. It came out more roughly than she intended. He considered her for a moment with those serious gray eyes. "I know that," he said. "I'm choosing to." He set her foot down gently, stood up, and went to the refrigerator to figure out dinner. Grace stared at the ice pack on her ankle and told herself very firmly that was not a romantic statement. It was just a factual one. He was a practical man, and this was a practical situation, and that was all. She told herself this several times. It helped about halfway. Ethan, meanwhile, was navigating the logistics of the arrangement with the pragmatic creativity of a child who takes life as he finds it. He had taken to informing anyone who would listen at school that he lived on a ranch and had horses and a cowboy. The cowboy portion of this information was delivered with particular pride. When his teacher, Ms. Flores, had asked about his family for a class project, Ethan had produced a drawing of Grace and Wyatt and himself, labeled in his blocky printing, Mom, Wyatt, me. No title, no category. Just the three of them in front of the barn, with very round horses in the background. Grace had found the drawing in his backpack and stood in the hallway holding it until her chest stopped aching. She put it on the refrigerator next to the ranch panorama. Wyatt saw it and said nothing, but that evening at dinner, he asked Ethan very seriously whether the horses were supposed to be round or whether that was a stylistic choice. "That's just how I draw horses," Ethan said with dignity. "The round ones are my favorite," Wyatt said. Ethan beamed. "The round ones are my favorite." Chapter 6. Feelings that break the rules. December arrived and brought with it the county's annual Christmas festival, held on the town square with lights strung between the live oaks and a fiddle band, and a pie competition that had been ongoing for 17 years. Cutter's Creek did Christmas the way small Texas towns have always done, thoroughly, enthusiastically, and with absolute conviction that this year's lights display was the best one yet. Going together was Ethan's idea, delivered at breakfast as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "We should go to the festival, as a family." Grace opened her mouth to explain, carefully, about the nature of their arrangement. Wyatt said, "What time does it start?" And that was that. They went on a Friday evening. And that was Ethan wore his hat, a miniature version of Wyatt's, which Cole had produced from somewhere without explanation, and he walked between them with the completely unself-conscious confidence of a child who belongs exactly where he is. He held Grace's hand on one side, and somewhere around the pie judging, reached up and took Wyatt's on the other. Wyatt looked down at the small hand in his. Then he looked at Grace over Ethan's head. She made a "what are you going to do" expression. He looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man processing new information. And then he closed his hand around Ethan's and kept walking. They ate fried food from paper boats and watched the fiddle competition, and Ethan won a plastic horse from a ring toss that he immediately named Gerald Jr., creating a small dynasty of Geralds in the process. Gerald Jr. People stopped them. Grace's co-worker Jenny, old Pete Larson, half a dozen families from Ethan's school, and greeted them as a unit, and Wyatt was awkward but present, and Grace smiled until her face ached with the complicated joy of it. At some point, standing by the hot cider booth, Wyatt's hand found the small of her back. Not dramatic, not staged, just there, a warm, steady pressure through her coat, as natural as weather. She did not step away from it. Later, she would think that was the moment she stopped lying to herself. Ethan fell asleep in the truck on the way home, curled across the back seat with Gerald Sr. and Gerald Jr. tucked under each arm. They drove in the dark with the heater on and the radio low, and the silence between them was different from the early silences. It had warmth in it now, and depth, and the particular quality of two people who are no longer pretending they are strangers. "I haven't been to the festival in years," Wyatt said. "Why not? Been to the festival in years?" He shrugged, one of those careful, contained movements. Seemed like something for families. Grace looked at him in the dim glow of the dashboard. "Wyatt," he glanced at her. "You deserve to have things like that," she said. "You don't have to earn it." He was quiet for a long moment. "You sound sure about that." "I am sure about that." He drove. The stars were very thick above the highway, the way they only are far enough from cities, and the ranch lights appeared on the horizon, and Grace thought, "I am in serious trouble, and I have been for weeks, and I have no idea what to do about it." 3 days later, she kissed him. It was not planned. It was barely even a decision. More like stepping off a curb without noticing it, the foot already in the air before the brain caught up. Off a curb without noticing. They had been standing in the barn, late afternoon, after she'd finished checking on the mare with the sore foreleg, and he had come in to find something, and they had ended up talking about the mare's recovery, and then somehow about the ranch and the history of it. And he had told her about his grandfather building the original barn, which had burned in a storm in 1987, and about being a boy watching his father rebuild it board by board, and she had watched his face while he talked. The way it opened when he spoke about this land, the guardedness dropping away, leaving something younger and softer and real. And she had thought, simply and completely, I am in love with this man. The thought arrived without drama, the way true things do. And then, because she was close enough, and because his eyes had come to rest on her face with that particular steady attention, she stood on her toes and kissed him. He went still for one frozen moment, and then kissed her back, with a thoroughness that suggested he had been thinking about it longer than she had, his hand coming up to her jaw with the same careful attention he gave everything. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. They both stepped back. Grace? That was my fault, she said immediately. I didn't say... The contract. She pressed both hands together, organizing herself. We have a contract. I'm sorry. That was me being... Grace. His voice was low and direct. Stop. She stopped. He looked at her with those gray eyes, and she could not read anything in them except that they were absolutely focused on her face. Don't apologize for that, he said. She searched his expression. Wyatt, I don't know what we're... Neither do I, he said. But don't apologize. Neither do I. They stood in the barn in the long November light with the horses moving softly in their stalls, and Grace thought, this is the most complicated simplicity I have ever been inside of. Chapter 7. The Woman from Wyatt's Past. She arrived on a Wednesday. Grace was at the clinic when it happened, so she got the story from Ethan, which was detailed and somewhat dramatically enhanced, and from Cole, who was less dramatic but more accurate. Her name was Renata Voss. She drove a white SUV with Austin plates and wore clothes that cost more than Grace's monthly salary, and she had, according to Cole's brief and careful accounting, been engaged to Wyatt Brooks 3 years ago, before calling it off 2 weeks before the wedding. She had apparently heard about the terms of the will, and she had apparently come to offer a solution. Grace found out when she came home at 5 o'clock and found Renata sitting at the kitchen table across from Wyatt, hands folded, expression carefully pleasant. She was beautiful in the particular polished way of women who have made their appearance a professional matter. Dark hair, good cheekbones, the kind of poise that reads as confidence from a distance. You must be Grace, she said, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I am, Grace said. Renata Voss. She didn't offer her hand. Wyatt and I have a history. I know, Grace said pleasantly. Wyatt mentioned it. Wyatt had not mentioned it. She was lying with the serene calm of a woman who has survived a difficult divorce and is not about to be managed in her own kitchen. Wyatt was looking at Grace with an expression she had not seen before. Something urgent beneath the surface, something that needed her to understand something he couldn't say in present company. Can I offer you something? Grace said to Renata, because she was not going to be outmaneuvered in hospitality. Coffee? Water? I'm fine, thank you. Renata's smile stayed in place. I'm fine, thank you. I was just explaining to Wyatt that if there's anything practical I can help with, I'd be happy to. Given that I understand this situation was arranged rather quickly. That's kind of you, Grace said. But we're managing. There was a pause. Renata looked at Grace with the evaluating gaze of a woman taking someone's measure, and Grace looked back with the patient steadiness of a woman who has stood on examining tables, holding frightened animals, and talked them calm. Renata left 20 minutes later. The truck wasn't out of the driveway before Grace turned to Wyatt. "She wants the ranch," she said. It wasn't a question. He sat back. "She wants to renegotiate." "What does that mean?" "It means she thinks our arrangement isn't real." He looked at his hands on the table. "And she thinks if she offers herself as a more—" He paused. "Legitimate option, I might reconsider." Grace absorbed this. "Will you?" He looked up sharply. "No." "Will you?" "Wyatt." "No," he said again, more quietly, but no less clearly. "She called off our engagement because she thought a cattle ranch in Cutter's Creek was beneath her. She hasn't changed, and whatever—" He stopped, started again. "Whatever this is between us, it's more real than anything we ever had." The kitchen was very quiet. "What is this between us?" Grace asked. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. He opened his mouth, and then Ethan barreled in from the back door in his muddy boots, carrying a frog he'd found in the garden, and absolutely needing to know whether frogs could be kept as pets in a boots box, and if so, what did they eat? The moment shattered like glass. Grace spent the next hour researching frog habitats and learning, with Ethan, that the frog's name was apparently Gerald III. She did not get an answer to her question that evening. She lay awake for a long time, waiting for her own thoughts to settle, and they did not. Wake for a long time. Chapter 8. The Truth About the Contract. 2 days later, Wyatt found her in the barn at dusk. She had been sitting in the empty stall beside Penny's, her back against the boards, her knees pulled up, thinking in the way that requires absolute stillness and limited company. Penny was nose down in her hay and uninterested in human emotional crises, which Grace found restful. She heard his boot steps. She didn't look up. He settled himself on the hay bale beside the stall door, his hat in his hands, and didn't speak for a while. That was one of the things she had come to know about him. He didn't rush toward words. He let silence do work first. "My father," he said finally, "was not an easy man to love." She looked up then. Wyatt was looking at his hat. He was hard, demanding. He had an idea of what a man should be, and he held onto it like a fence post in a flood. When my mother left, I was 12. He decided that was proof that people couldn't be trusted to stay. I was 12. He turned the hat in his hands. So he stopped letting anyone close enough to leave. Grace waited. "I learned that from him," Wyatt said. "I'm good at keeping people at a distance. I've had a lot of practice." He paused. "Renata leaving, 3 years ago, that confirmed what he'd taught me. That you let someone in, they decide you're not enough, and they go." "Wyatt." "I'm telling you this," he said, "because you asked me what this is between us, and I walked away from the question. And that's—" He stopped. "That's something I learned from a man I don't want to keep being." Grace set her arms on her knees and looked at him. The barn was warm with the smell of hay and horse, and the light was that specific amber that comes just before dark, and Wyatt Brooks was sitting with his hat in his hands, looking like a man learning how to be afraid of something on purpose. "The contract was never just business," he said. "Not after the first week?" Her heart made a slow, serious movement. "After the first week? You and Ethan?" He shook his head. "I don't know how to say this the right way, so I'll just say it plain. You made this place feel like what it was supposed to be. What I think my father was actually trying to say, underneath all the legal language and the conditions. He didn't want me to have a wife on paper. He wanted me to have this." He gestured, a gesture that encompassed the barn, the ranch, the house where Ethan was presumably engaged in his nightly project of naming new objects. "This. People to come home to." Grace stood up. She walked to the hay bale and sat beside him, close, and took one of his hands from his hat. He went very still. "I'm not going to tell you it isn't complicated," she said. "Because it is. I have a son whose heart is involved. I came here for financial reasons. We signed a piece of paper that has an end date on it." She looked at their joined hands. "But you should know that I stopped being able to see that end date a while ago. And I don't know what to do with that exactly. But I thought you should know." He turned his hand over and held hers properly. "The year ends December 31st, he said. "I know. If you want to go after that, I won't." He stopped. "I won't make it harder than it has to be. I want you to know that." "What if I don't want to go?" He looked at her. Really looked, the way he'd looked at the ranch the first time he'd told her about his grandfather, with something open and vulnerable and absolutely real. "Then don't," he said. That simple. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He sat very still for a moment, as if surprised, and then let out a long, slow breath, the way a man does when he's been holding something for a very long time, and put his arm around her. They sat in the barn while the amber light faded, and Penny finished her hay, and the sounds of the ranch settled into evening. And it was, Grace thought, the most honest moment she had been inside since she could remember. Chapter 9. Walking away. She almost left. It happened 6 days before Christmas, and it happened because of a phone call, and Grace would spend a long time afterward understanding that sometimes the things you have been waiting to fall apart are not the things that actually do. Her sister called from Houston. Her sister, who was practical and occasionally right about things, who had been skeptical of the whole arrangement from the beginning, and who had a talent for identifying problems Grace was trying not to see. "The year ends in 2 weeks, her sister said. "I know." "And then what, Grace?" We've talked about it." "Have you actually talked about it?" "We've talked about it." "Or did you sit in a barn and hold hands and say some nice things and decide the rest would work itself out?" Grace did not answer, which was itself an answer. Her sister sighed. "What happens to Ethan if this falls apart in 6 months? He's completely attached to that man, to that ranch. You said yourself he talks about Wyatt like he's the father he never had. What happens to him when the real world shows up?" "The real world is already here," Grace said. "Is it? Because from where I'm standing, you've been living in a fairy tale on a beautiful ranch where a handsome cowboy is nice to your son and makes you feel safe. And that's wonderful. But cowboys don't change their lives for convenience marriages, Grace. He's going to wake up in January when the legal pressure is off and realize he's a 40-year-old bachelor who likes his solitude, and you and your son are—" "Don't," Grace said, "are a complication he didn't actually sign up for." Grace said. The call ended shortly after that, and Grace sat on the edge of the guest bed, her bed, though it had never quite felt entirely like hers, and listened to the particular silence of a house where the person you might be falling in love with is somewhere in the other rooms, and considered how thoroughly and efficiently her sister had placed every fear she'd been carefully managing into a single 2-minute phone call. The fear was not a new one. It had always been there, under everything. That this was temporary, not because of a contract, but because she and Ethan were the kind of people things happened to, not the kind things stayed for. Derek had not stayed. The apartment in San Antonio had not stayed. $1,200 a month was not something that stayed. Something always needed it more. She thought about Ethan coming in from riding with his face sunburned and filthy and completely lit from within, and from riding with his face. She thought about how that boy would feel, having found exactly the life he'd been missing, having to leave it. She thought, I have to protect him, even from things that look like love, if they aren't going to last. She began, very quietly, to think about what leaving would look like. She did not leave. What happened instead was that she went downstairs to tell Wyatt that she thought they should talk about the end of the contract, and what she found when she got there was that Wyatt had a piece of paper on the kitchen table. Not the original contract. Something new. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. He heard her and looked up. I was coming to find you, he said. What is that? He looked at the paper. I talked to my lawyer. The will's conditions will be met as of December 31st. After that, I don't... He stopped, started again. After that, I don't want you to feel like you're here because you have to be. After that. So I drafted a document releasing you from the original contract terms. You keep the lump sum payment regardless. The arrangement is over, and you're free. Grace looked at him across the kitchen. You're releasing me. Yes. Because? Because you should choose. His voice was low. Not because of financial need or a contract or any arrangement. If you stay, I need it to be because you're choosing to. Not because you feel obligated. Not because it's convenient. He pushed the paper across the table. This makes that choice clean. She walked to the table. She looked at the document. She thought about her sister's phone call. She thought about Wyatt sitting in the barn with his hat in his hands, saying, I'm telling you this because I don't want to keep being the man my father made. She looked up. What do you want, Wyatt? He met her eyes. You know what I want. Say it. Something moved through his expression. That flash of vulnerable exposure he usually kept so carefully guarded. That flash of, I want you and Ethan to stay, he said. Not for a year. Not on a contract. I want... He stopped, and she could see how much it cost him, every word. I want to figure out what we're building here. I want Ethan to have his room and his window and his round horse drawings on the fridge. I want... His voice went rough. I want to be someone he can count on. Someone you can count on. That's what I want. The kitchen was very quiet. Grace looked at the release document on the table. She looked at Wyatt Brooks, who had started this whole thing as a stranger with a business proposition and had become, somewhere in the months between, the most real thing in her life. She picked up the document. She tore it in half. Wyatt stared at her. I'm not leaving, she said. Not because of the contract, because I'm choosing not to. That clear enough? He was around the table before she finished the sentence. Clear enough? Chapter 10. The Family. He never expected. Christmas morning came to Brooks Ranch the way the best mornings do. Slowly, with light. Grace woke to the sound of boots in the hallway and Ethan's voice at a volume that suggested he had found something wonderful. She lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the house, and felt the particular wholeness of it settle into her chest, like something long waited. She heard Wyatt's voice, low and patient. She heard Ethan say, "But is it mine? Like, actually mine?" She heard Wyatt say, "Actually yours." She was out of bed and at the top of the stairs in approximately 11 seconds. In the barn, in the stall beside Penny's, stood a small paint pony with a red ribbon around her neck that Ethan was absolutely losing his mind over. She was dun-colored with a white blaze and a placid, sweet-eyed temperament that suggested she had been chosen very deliberately for a 7-year-old who was still learning. Ethan was standing in front of her with both hands pressed to his own face, which was the physical expression of a joy that had exceeded normal containment. "What's her name?" he breathed. "That's up to you," Wyatt said. Ethan turned to Grace, then to Wyatt, then back to the pony with the seriousness of a person facing an important historical decision. "Her name," he said slowly, tasting the gravity of it, "is Lady Grace." Grace made a sound she immediately tried to turn into a cough. Wyatt looked at her. His eyes were warm with something she had stopped trying to put away or classify. "Lady Grace it is," he said. "Classify." They spent Christmas Day the way Grace had stopped letting herself imagine Christmas days. All three of them, with Cole and his wife Rosa joining for dinner, and the long table set with mismatched plates, and Rosa's tamales, and a pie Grace had made from a recipe she'd found in a box of the late Margaret Brooks's things that Wyatt had quietly left out for her one morning. The house was full in a way it hadn't been full in a very long time. Wyatt sat at the head of the table that had belonged to his grandfather, and he looked around it at the people passing dishes and laughing and arguing affectionately about the correct preparation of cornbread. And Grace watched his face from across the table and saw the moment it arrived. The specific, private expression of a man who has gotten something he stopped believing was possible. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his palm up and held on. December 31st arrived without fanfare. Held on. Grace woke up on the last day of the year and lay in the room that had become genuinely hers. She knew it by the smell of it now, the angle of the morning light, the sound of the cattle in the distance, and thought about what happens when the end date of something comes and goes and the thing itself remains. She found Wyatt on the back porch with his coffee, watching the sky lighten over the eastern ridge. "It's today?" she said. "I know." She stood beside him. "How does it feel?" He considered the horizon for a moment. "Like the beginning of something," he said. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Yeah," she said. "That's what I thought too." He pressed a kiss to her hair, easy and unhesitating, the way you do when a thing is settled. They got married again in the spring. This time, it was not a courtroom under fluorescent lights. In the spring, it was the ranch, under a sky that had gone the clear, warm blue of late April, with wildflowers in the pastures and the horses visible in the far field, and every person in Cutter's Creek who wanted to come, which was most of them. Ethan served as ring-bearer again. This time, he took the responsibility with ceremonial gravity, marching down the aisle between the chairs set on the lawn, with a concentration that drew a visible wave of collective affection from everyone watching. Grace wore a dress the color of cream and her grandmother's earrings, and held a small bunch of blue bonnets, and when she reached the place where Wyatt was standing, in his good hat and a clean button-down that Cole had somehow convinced him to iron, and she saw his face, she thought, there it is, the real one. He looked at her like she was everything he'd been protecting all his life before he knew what he was protecting it for. Deanna cried from the front row. She had told Grace this would happen. Deanna cried from the... Gerald the frog watched from a jar on the table with the guest book, having been brought by Ethan as, in his words, the official ranch representative. "Do you, Wyatt Aaron Brooks, take this woman?" "I do," Wyatt said, before the officiant finished the sentence. A ripple of laughter moved through the guests. Grace looked up at him with her eyes bright. "We're supposed to wait until..." the officiant started. "I know," Wyatt said, unabashedly, "but I've been waiting long enough." Grace laughed, a real one, full and clear, the kind that feels like the first warm day after a long winter. She reached up and took his face in both her hands. "Same," she said. "I do, completely." That evening, After the guests had gone and Cole had put the chairs away and Rosa had wrapped up the leftover cake, Grace found Ethan asleep in the barn. He had dragged his sleeping bag out and settled himself in the stall with Lady Grace, his back against the pony's flank, Gerald Sr. and Gerald Jr. tucked under his arm. He was smiling in his sleep with the absolute uncomplicated peace of a child who is exactly where he belongs. Grace stood in the barn door and breathed. Wyatt appeared beside her. She'd heard his boots on the path. He looked at their son for a long moment. Their son. She'd started thinking of it that way, quietly, weeks ago. "Should we move him?" she asked. "He's fine," Wyatt said. "Lady Grace won't move on him." "She might." "She won't. They have an understanding." Grace looked at him. He was watching Ethan with an expression that was no longer complicated. It was clear and warm and certain, the way the sky looks after the weather has finally passed. "Wyatt," she said softly, "are you happy?" He took a moment, the way he took most moments, with deliberate attention, not wasting them. "Yes," he said, not wasting them, just that. "Yes." She took his hand in the warm barn dark, and somewhere in the pasture, a horse moved, and the night insects sang, and the stars over Texas were the kind of thick and permanent that remind you the universe is mostly composed of light, even when you can't see it. Later, Grace would think about all the ways she might have described the year that had changed her life. She might have called it a business arrangement, a calculated risk, a temporary solution. She might have listed its terms and conditions, its clauses, and its exit strategies. She might have talked about the contract that was supposed to be simple. What she would say instead, when anyone asked, was this: "I needed a safe place for my son, and I found something I had stopped believing was real." And Wyatt, when anyone asked him which was rarer, because he had never been a man of many words, would say, "My father left me 1,200 acres and a condition." He thought he was talking about a legal document, acres and a condition. He wasn't. He was talking about this. And he would look at Grace and at Ethan and at the ranch that had held his family's story for generations, and now held one more chapter of it and one more after that. And that, as the people of Cutter's Creek would agree unanimously, was more than enough. The end. The Cowboys' Temporary Family by Joan Savage.